The sun died slow over Slable Creek, orange, bled into rust, rust into ash. The sky cracked open above the empty fields. On the porch of the weathered ranch house, the man sat motionless in his wheelchair, hands resting on his knees. 5 years of staring down that road had left him with nothing but dust and silence. Inside the house, floorboards creaked in his memory, sounds made by legs that no longer worked. Wheels squeaked in the distance, a raw, broken sound. Beneath it came heavy footsteps, too deliberate and too heavy for any ordinary woman. The man gripped the wheels and tried to rise. His body stayed frozen. A figure appeared at the gate, tall as a doorway, broad shoulders blocking the last light. She carried a massive bundle, as if it weighed nothing. Her patched dress a map of old repairs. She stopped, looked straight at him. No flinch, no pity in her eyes like everyone else. The wind gusted harder, stirring dust across the yard and pressing against the quiet house. She pushed the gate open with her own hands and stepped through without waiting for permission. The sun was dying slow over Slable Creek, orange going to rust, rust going to ash. Elias Rourke sat where he always sat. Same chair, same porch board that groaned under the left wheel, same view of a road that never brought anything but dust and disappointment. 5 years now, 5 years of watching that road do nothing. His hands lay still on his knees, knees that didn't feel the hands anymore, didn't feel anything. Hadn't felt anything since the day a spooked mare threw him into a dry riverbed, and wigonked until back that no doctor, no prayer, no whiskey could fix. He used to be somebody, best rider from here to the territory line. Men tipped their hats. Women found reasons to walk past the corral. He had land, cattle, a name that meant something. He had Adeline, married her at 20. 7 good years after that. 7 years of trying for a child that never came. 7 years of doctors in the city with their cold instruments and colder words. 7 years of Adeline crying quiet by the window, thinking he didn't hear, he heard. He just didn't know how to say the only thing that mattered, that it wasn't her fault, that he'd have loved her with or without a baby in the cradle, except he never said it, because saying it out loud made it real. And a man doesn't cry in front of his wife. Not out here, not in this country, so she left instead. A letter on the kitchen table, handwriting shaking like a leaf in wind, said she was sorry, said she needed to be a mother more than she needed to be his wife, said the two things had never once, not for a single day, felt like the same thing. He didn't chase her, couldn't even if he wanted to. Not after the accident took the last thing pride hadn't already stolen. 2 years after she rode off, the horse threw him. 2 years of trying to drown a hollow chest in work, in risk, in a kind of reckless riding that dared the world to finish him off, and the world obliged. Now here he was, 34 years old, rancher without a family, rider without legs. King of a kingdom he couldn't walk across. 5 years on this porch, watching the sun die the same way every single evening. Like it was mocking him. Like it knew something he didn't. The nights were the worst. Not because of the dark, because of the quiet inside it. A house built for a family echoing back. Nothing but his own breathing, his own heartbeat, his own name spoken by no one at all. He had learned, over 5 years, exactly how many creaks the floorboards made walking from the kitchen to the porch, because he heard them in memory, from a body that no longer made them. Every single night before he slept, he kept the ranch running the way a dying man keeps his affairs, in order. Out of habit. Out of stubbornness. Jedediah managed most of it now, an old hand who'd worked this land since before Elias could walk, let alone stop our walking. The herds were smaller, the fences sagged, the barn leaked in 3 places nobody had the will to climb up and fix. It was a ranch the way a photograph is a person. The shape was there. The life wasn't. Until the afternoon everything changed. He heard the wheels before he saw them. A cart, slow. One wheel squeaking bad enough to wake the dead. And under that squeak something else. Footsteps, heavy ones. Heavier than any woman's had a right to be. He looked up, and what he saw made him forget for one full second that his legs didn't work anymore, because some part of him tried to stand. Old instinct, old muscle memory screaming at a body that couldn't answer. She was tall, not tall like a tall woman is tall, tall like a doorway, like a tall muffling out of a story you tell children to make them behave. Her head nearly brushed the top rail of his gate. Her shoulders filled the frame of it. She wore a dress patched so many times it had become a quilt of itself, and she carried a bundle of belongings that would have staggered a mule. Carried it like it weighed nothing at all, her face, though. Her face was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the walking. Tired the way a person gets tired of being looked at. She stopped at the gate, studied him, didn't flinch, didn't soften her eyes the way strangers usually did when they clocked the wheelchair. She just looked, straight on. Like he was a man and not a tragedy somebody ought to whisper about. "You're Rourke," she said. "Not a question. Depends who's asking. Somebody who's been walking 3 days and needs a roof before dark, he should have said no. He'd said no to worse offers with better manners." Something in her voice stopped the word in his throat. "You need somewhere to sleep," he said instead. "This ain't a hotel." "No." She set the bundle down, rolled her shoulder like it ached. "It's a ranch that hasn't had a full crew working it in 5 years, and I'm strong enough to do the work of 4 men. So maybe it's not charity you'd be doing, Mr. Rourke. Maybe it's a trade. He almost laughed. "Almost, lady, I don't even know your name, Odessa Kane. And what exactly are you trading, Odessa Kane? Besides showing up at a stranger's gate at sundown?" She looked at him then. Really looked. And there was something old in that look. Something that had absorbed 1,000 cruelties and decided, somewhere along the road, not to let a single one of them win. "You need someone who can carry this whole ranch," she said. "And I need a roof over my head." Seems like a fair trade to me. Silence. Just the wind moving through dead grass. Just his own heartbeat, loud and stupid in his ears, because nobody had spoken to him like that in 5 years. Not the neighbors with their pity-soft voices. Not his own cousin with his oil-slick concern. Not one person had looked at Elias Ross and seen anything but a broken man in a chair waiting his turn to die. This woman hadn't even blinked at the chair. "You don't know anything about me," he said, voice rougher than he meant it. "I know you're sitting on a porch at sundown instead of inside where it's warm. I know there's no smoke coming from that chimney. I know a house with no woman's hand in it for years when I see one." She tilted her head. "And I know what it is to have people decide who you are before you say a word." That landed somewhere deep. Somewhere he'd bricked up a long time ago. One night he heard himself say. "One night," she repeated. And something in her shoulders eased, just barely, like she'd been braced for the door to slam and it hadn't. "There's a room at the back. Hasn't been opened in years. Might have mice. I've slept in worse." He believed her. She pushed the gate open herself. He noticed that. Didn't wait for him to struggle with it. Didn't make a show of noticing he couldn't do it himself, either. She just opened it, walked through, picked her bundle back up like it was a sack of feathers, and waited for him to point the way. And Elias Rourke. Cattleman. Widower of a marriage that never technically ended in death, crippled by his own reckoning, wheeled himself down the porch ramp his men had built him out of pity 5 years back, and led a giant of a woman into the house he'd been slowly dying inside of. Neither one of them said much else that first night. He showed her the back room, apologized for the dust, told her where the well was, in case she needed water before morning. She thanked him plainly, without the syrupy gratitude he'd half expected, and shut the door behind her like a woman closing a chapter rather than opening one. He lay awake a long while, staring at a ceiling he knew by heart, listening for sound that weren't there. No footsteps down the hall. No voice humming to itself the way Adeline used to hum while she undressed for bed. Just the house, settling the way old houses settle, and somewhere behind a door he'd forgotten existed. A stranger sleeping under his roof for the first time in 5 years. Had shifted. Something neither one of them was ready to name. Morning came with a smell that didn't belong in that house anymore. Coffee, real coffee, and under it, something frying. Bacon, maybe. Bread. Elias woke slow, disoriented, half convinced he was dreaming, because the last 5 years of mornings had smelled like nothing. Like dust and old wood and whatever Nettie, the woman who came We left cold on the stove 3 days running. This smelled like a kitchen with a person in it. He rolled himself down the hall, arms burning the way they always burned, and found her there, Odessa. Sleeves pushed up, hair tied back, standing at a stove that hadn't been properly lit in years, like she'd known it her whole life. She didn't turn around. Didn't figure you for an early riser, she said. Didn't figure you for still being here. Said one night she flipped up something in the pan. Never said I wasn't a woman of my word about the trade part too. Man doesn't get breakfast for free around me. I don't recall agreeing to a trade. You didn't disagree either. She set a plate down in front of him. Eggs, bread, bacon, crisped just right. Eat. You're thin as a fence post. He looked at the plate. Looked at her. You always this bossy with strangers? Only the ones sitting on porches wasting away? Instead of eating, she poured herself coffee. Didn't sit. Just leaned against the counter and watched him, with an expression he couldn't read yet. What'd you live on before I got here? Air? Whatever Nettie left. Twice a week, Josie almost laughed. Almost. First time in longer than he wanted to admit they ate. Not much talk. But it wasn't the silence of the last 5 years either. It was a different kind of quiet. The kind two people share when neither one's decided yet if they trust the other, but neither one's in a hurry to leave the room. He found himself watching her hands as she worked. Scarred, strong, capable hands that moved with the quiet economy of someone who'd sought in her whole life, been able to afford a wasted motion. There was a story in those hands he could tell, the way there's a story written into the growth rings of an old tree, and he found himself wanting to know it, for he'd even decided he was allowed to ask. Jedediah Holt found them like that. Old ranch hand worked for Elias's father before him. The only man Elias had never had the heart to send away, even when he'd sent everyone else packing. Jedediah stopped in the doorway, looked at the smoke rising proper from the chimney, looked at the woman standing near 7 feet tall in the middle of a kitchen that had been a tomb for half a decade. Well, he said slowly. I'll be Jedediah, Elias said. This is Odessa Kane. She's staying on. Working the ranch, Jedediah's eyebrows went up somewhere near his hairline. So staying on, he repeated. That a problem? No, sir. Jedediah took off his hat, which he did not do for just anybody. No problem at all. He accepted a plate from her without being asked twice, sat at the far end of the table, and studied her the way an old ranch hand studies weather. Not suspicious exactly, just careful. A man who had seen enough seasons to know that Sunchudfutardshuden sometimes came with a cost nobody mentioned until the bill arrived. You handle a horse? He asked her, mouth half full. I handle whatever needs handling. That ain't an answer. It's the only one that's ever mattered. She refilled his coffee without asking. The gesture so natural it took Jedediah a moment to notice he hadn't finished the first cup. Give me a day's work before you decide what I can and can't do, Mr. Holt. Save us both some talking. Jedediah looked at Elias. Elias shrugged, the closest thing to amusement he'd allowed himself in longer than he could count. Fair enough, the old man said, and went back to his eggs, though his eyes kept drifting to her, cataloging. The way a man catalogs a gift horse he isn't yet sure he's allowed to keep. She worked like nothing Elias had ever seen, not in a month, not in a year. In his whole life, she hauled water 2 buckets to a hand where most men needed a yoke and both arms. She split firewood with an axe that looked like a toy in her grip. And the wood didn't just split, it exploded. Clean and fast, stacked before most men would have finished the first swing. She lifted fence posts that took 2 men, and a mule to move, lifted them alone, sank them deep, moved the next one without stopping to catch her breath. Ilias watched from his chair on the porch, watched and told himself he was only watching to make sure she didn't hurt herself. That was a lie, and he knew it. He was watching because something in his chest, something that had gone quiet and cold 5 years back, kept doing this strange, stuttering thing every time she moved. He didn't have a word for that feeling, yet didn't want one. By the end of the first week, the corral fence stood straighter than it had in a decade. By the end of the second, the barn roof no longer whipped rust-colored water onto the hay whenever it rained. She worked from before first light until the sun quit for the day, and when he tried, clumsily, to tell her to slow down, to rest, she looked at him with an expression that made the words shrivel in his mouth. Rest is for folks who've got somebody to catch them if they fall behind. She told him once, not unkindly, just plain. I've never had that luxury, don't much know what to do with it. That evening, Jedediah found him alone by the corral, cleaning a bridle that didn't need cleaning. You know who she is, Jedediah said. Not a question, she's Odessa Kane, works hard. Minds her business, that ain't what I asked. Elias set the bridle down. Looked up at the old man. Say what you're gonna say, Jedediah. Jedediah sighed. Sat down on an overturned barrel across from him. And told him about the traveling shows that passed through towns like this one, the ones with the painted wagons and the barkers out front, shouting about wonders and marvels. Told him about a name Elias had heard once years back. In some newspaper somebody left in the saloon. Odessa the Giantess. Barnaby Slate's Menagerie of Wonders. She was in that outfit, Jedediah said. Years. Slate had her standing on a platform for a nickel a look. Had folks poking at her like she was livestock at auction. Paid her next to nothing. Worked her sick some winters. Word is she finally ran in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back. Because Slate would have come after his property. Otherwise, that's what he called her. Property. Elias sat with that a long moment because it explained something. Explained the way she stood so straight, chin up, like she was daring the world to say something so she could prove it wrong. Explained the wall behind her eyes. No, he's not open, Elias said slowly. No, sir, she's running from a cage. That's about the shape of it. Elias looked out toward the barn, where he could just make out her silhouette in the dying light. Still working, still moving like stopping. Was there some kind of failure? Something in him. Something he thought the accident had crushed flat and buried, twisted hard. Because he knew that feeling. The feeling of people deciding what you are before you've said a single word. The feeling of being looked at like a spectacle instead of a person. He'd lived it for 5 years in this very chair. She'd lived it her whole life. She know you know? He asked. Ain't my place to tell her, I told you. Figured that was yours to decide. Elias nodded slowly. Filed the knowledge away like a man filing away something fragile, something he wasn't yet sure how to hold without breaking. He didn't bring it up to her that night, or the next. But he watched her differently after that. Not with pity. With something closer to reverence, the way a person looks at a survivor of something they themselves have only glimpsed just the edges of. The storm didn't announce itself the way storms usually did out here. No slow build. No gathering clouds you could watch coming for an hour. It came fast and mean off the mountains, dumping rain like the sky had a grudge. And within an hour, Sable Creek was doing something it hadn't done in a decade. It was rising. Elias heard the shouting before he heard words. Jedediah, out in the yard, soaked to the bone, screaming something about the lower pasture, about the cattle, about the old floodgate down by the creek bend, the one that kept the water from cutting straight through the herd's grazing ground, the one that hadn't been reinforced since before the accident, because there'd been no money and no crew and no reason to fix what nobody was using properly anymore. That gate was failing. And 40 head of cattle were penned exactly where the water wanted to go. Elias wheeled himself out onto the porch, rain hammering sideways into his face, and watched the scene unfold like something out of a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Because he couldn't get down there. Couldn't wade into that current. Couldn't do one single thing except sit in this chair and watch his herd, the only thing left of his father's legacy, drown in front of him. Except Odessa was already running toward the creek, toward the gate, toward 40 tons of panicked cattle and a wall of rising water that would have knocked a grown man off his feet in essence. Odessa, his voice cracked on it. Odessa, get back. You can't. She didn't stop. He watched her reach the gate. Watched the water hit her, watched her stagger, catch herself, plant her feet wide in mud that was sucking at everything it touched. The gate had buckled at the hinge, swinging loose, and the current was widening the gap by the second. Cattle already crowding toward the break, toward the water, toward disaster. She grabbed the gate with both hands and held it. Elias would replay that image for years. The image of a woman alone in the storm, braced against a wall of water and mud and wood, muscles standing out in her arms like cords of rope, holding a gate that should have needed 3 men and a chain to hold, holding with nothing but her own 2 hands and a will that refused to bend. Jedediah, she bellowed over the storm. The post! Bring the post, Jedediah scrambled. Grabbed a fence post from the pile by the barn, fought the wind, dragged it toward her. She took it one-handed, still holding the gate with the other, drove it into the mud at an angle, wedged it against the gate frame, and only when the makeshift brace held did she let go. She stumbled back, fell to one knee in the mud, and the gate held. The cattle, spooked and shoving, pressed against the fence line but did not break through, did not scatter into the current, did not drown. Elias sat frozen on that porch, rain running down his fist, indistinguishable now from anything else running down his face, and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut since the day a doctor with cold hands told him the word never, because he had never, not once in 34 years, seen anything like what he'd just witnessed. Not strength like that, not courage like that. She got up, wiped mud from her face with the back of one hand, looked toward the porch, toward him, through the rain, and he looked back at her, not with pity. God, not with pity, with something closer to awe. The rain kept falling long after the danger had passed, a steady gray curtain that turned the yard to soup and the road to a river of its own. Jedediah and 2 of the hands who'd stayed on herded the shaken cattle up to higher ground, counting heads by lantern light, calling out numbers into the storm like men keeping score in a game they were terrified to lose. Elias stayed on the porch the whole time, useless in every practical sense, and yet unable to make himself go inside, unwilling to look away from the woman who had just with nothing but her own 2 hands saved the only inheritance left in the world. She didn't come find him until the rain had thinned to a drizzle, until the cattle had been counted and Wicklow counted, and all 40 head stood accounted for in the mud-soaked dark. She came up the porch, stepped slow, favoring one side, and he saw for the first time that her forearm was scraped raw, where the gate had torn skin. You're hurt, he said. Voice rough. I'm fine, Odessa. I said I'm fine, Rourke, but she sat down on the top step anyway, close to his chair, closer than she'd been since she arrived. They sat in silence a moment, rain ticking off the eaves, the smell of wet earth and relief. You could have drowned, he said finally. I didn't. You could have. She turned to look at him. Something tired in her eyes. Something that had heard this exact conversation 100 times in different words, from different mouths, in different tones. You want to know something, Rourke? Her voice was low. Steady. For 10 years people paid a nickel to stand behind a rope and look at me like I was some kind of curiosity. Like my size was a joke God played and they'd come to laugh at the punchline. Nobody ever once thought to ask what all this. She held up one scraped, powerful hand might actually be good for. I'm not laughing. No. Something shifted in her expression, softened just barely, like ice giving half an inch. You're not. He didn't know what to say to that. Didn't trust his voice not to crack if he tried. So he said the only true thing he had. Thank you. 2 words. That was all. But she looked at him like they weighed more than anything anyone had said to her in a decade. Don't thank me, she said, standing, wincing as she did. Told you already. It's a trade, she went inside. He sat on that porch, a long while after. Rain stopped now, stars beginning to needle through the breaking clouds, and thought about the word trade. Thought about how it wasn't really that at all. Not anymore, not after tonight. Because a trade means don't let both sides walk away even. And he had a feeling, sitting there in the wet dark, that he was getting the better end of whatever this was turning into. He thought, too, about the newspaper name Jedediah had told him. Odessa the Giantess. He thought about the nickel and the rope and the strangers who had paid to laugh, and about the word property spoken so casually by a man who had once believed he owned her the way a man owns a plow horse. Maso. He wondered, sitting there, how many nights she had spent exactly like this, aching, wet, unthanked, and how many mornings after that she had gotten up anyway, because there was no one else who would. He didn't sleep well that night, but for the first time in 5 years, it wasn't loneliness keeping him up. Word travels faster than a man on a fast horse in a town this small. And it travels when it's got somebody's cousin doing the talking. Warwick Rourke rode up to the gate 3 days after the storm. Didn't announce himself. Didn't need to. Elias heard the horse and knew the rider before he ever saw the man's face. The we know a particular kind of weather is coming by the smell of the air. Warwick sat his horse at the gate like he already owned the land under it. Fine vest, gold ring, catching the afternoon light. Smile that showed a lot of teeth and not 1 ounce of truth. Well, cousin. Warwick's eyes swept the yard. Found Odessa near the barn, hanging wet linens on a line strung between 2 posts, and lingered there a beat too long, a beat that made Elias's jaw tighten before a single ugly word had even been said. State your business, Warwick. Can't a man visit family? Warwick's gaze slid back to Odessa, traveled up her, slow, insolent. Heard talk in town, didn't believe it till now. They said you'd taken in some kind of, he paused, savoring it, giant woman. Didn't say how big, my word. Odessa's hands stilled on the wet cloth, didn't turn around, but Elias saw her shoulders go rigid. Careful, Elias said, voice flat as a blade. Careful of what? Speaking the truth? Warwick chuckled, low and oily. You know how women like that operate, cousin. Show up sweet as pie at some lonely man's door. Clean his house. Warm his bed if he's lucky or unlucky, depending how you look at a woman built like a barn door. And before you know it, get off my land. The words came out of Elias like something breaking loose. Not loud, worse than loud. Cold. Final. Warwick blinked. Wasn't used to being cut off. Not by the cousin he'd spent 5 years visiting twice a season with tobacco and newspapers and a vulture's patient eye on the property lines. Now, Elias, you rode onto my land and insulted the woman working it. In front of me. That's the last insult you get to make here. I'm only saying what the whole town's already saying. Warwick's smile thinned, showing something meaner underneath. That some circus freaks got her hooks in a cripple. Who can't even, he didn't finish the sentence because Elias had already gripped the wheels of his chair and was moving. Fast. Faster than a man in that chair had any business moving, rolling straight toward Warwick's horse, until the animal shied back a step, until Warwick himself had to catch the reins to keep from being unseated by nothing but the sheer force of a man who refused to be small anymore. Say that word again, Elias said low, and see what happens. Silence. Long and taut as a drawn rope, Odessa had turned now, was watching. Elias didn't look at her, couldn't afford to. Every ounce of him was aimed at the man on the horse. You've got no legs, cousin, Warwick said, quieter now, some of the swagger draining out of him. What exactly do you think you're going to do? I don't need legs to know what's right, Elias's voice didn't waver. That woman pulled 40 head of cattle back from a flood 3 nights ago, with her bare hands while you were probably drinking somewhere warm and dry, planning how fast you could carve up my land the day I finally die. She's done more honest work in a week than you've done in 5 years of visits. So you can ride back to town and tell whoever's listening the cripple's lost his mind to hide over a giant. I don't care, but you say one more word about her on my land, and I will have a Dedaiah escort you off it. Every time. For the rest of your life, Warwick's jaw worked. Something calculating flickered behind his eyes, quick and gone, the look of a man revising a plan rather than abandoning it. You've changed, cousin, he said finally. Damn right I have. Warwick pulled his horse around. Paused once, looked back not at Elias this time, but at Odessa, a long, cold look that promised this wasn't finished. Not by a mile. We'll see how long that lasts, he said, and off in a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after the sound of hooves had faded. Elias sat there, chest heaving, hands still gripping the wheels of his chair so hard. His knuckles had gone white. Odessa walked over slowly, stood beside him. Looked down the road where the dust was still settling. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, I did. She looked at him then. Really looked. The way she had that first evening at the gate, except something had changed in the look now. Something had softened at the edges. Nobody's ever done that, she said. Not once. Not in 10 years. Well, he cleared his throat, looked away, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. Somebody was overdue. She almost smiled. Almost. Come on, she said. Supper's getting cold, and he followed her in, wheels crunching over the dirt, the sun sliding low and gold behind them. And for the first time in 5 years, the house he wheeled into didn't feel like a tomb waiting on its last occupant. It felt for the first time since a doctor's cold voice had said the word never, like it might actually be a home again. The weeks that followed moved away. Water moves over stone, slows, steady, wearing away things nobody sees until one day they simply weren't there anymore. The barn got a new roof. The corral fence, sagging for years, stood straight again, post by post, most of them sunk by Odessa's own hands, while Jedediah directed and old ranches, who drifted off in the lean years, started drifting back, drawn by rumors of a working ranch again, of a woman who could do the labor of 4 men, and a boss, who'd remembered how to give orders instead of just enduring days. Elias found himself doing things he hadn't done in years, reviewing accounts at the kitchen table with a lamp burning late. Riding out not on a horse, never that again, but in the modified cart Jedediah rigged up with a ramp to check the herd himself, instead of taking second-hand reports on faith. Laughing, actually laughing once, when Odessa lost a wrestling match with a particularly stubborn calf and came back to the house covered head to toe in mud, cursing in language that would have scandalized the church ladies in town. He caught himself watching her more than he should, caught himself finding reasons to be wherever she happened to be working. Caught himself, one evening on the porch, reaching for her hand before he even realized what he was doing, and pulling back just as fast, heart hammering, because some old fear, older than the accident, older than Adeline's letter on the kitchen table, whispered that reaching for anything good was just asking to have it taken away again. She noticed. He could tell she noticed, but neither one of them said a word about it, because some silences aren't empty. Some silences are just two people, both burned before, deciding together, without ever discussing it, to walk slow towards something that scared them both more than any flood or any storm or any cruel word a cousin on horseback could ever throw. And that, Elias thought one evening, watching the sun go down gold and easy instead of gray and hollow, that kind of silence was its own kind of hope. The dangerous kind. The kind that, once it takes root, can't be pulled back out without tearing something vital along with it. He didn't know yet how much that hope was about to cost them both. He only knew that for the first time in 5 years, he was afraid of losing something again, which meant, for the first time in 5 years, he had something worth losing. Autumn came to Sable Creek, dressed like nothing was wrong. Gold light. Cool mornings. Cattle fat and larded healthy in the lower pasture that hadn't drowned, thanks to a woman most of the towns hadn't learned to look at without whispering first, because that's what towns do. They whisper. Before they think. Before they know. They whisper first and ask questions never. And this town had plenty to whisper about. It started small. The way poison always starts small. A word here. A raised eyebrow there. Somebody's wife saying something at the mercantile counter that nobody could quite trace back to its source, except everybody somehow already knew where it started. Rourke's gone soft on some circus giant, living together out there. Unmarried. Alone. You imagine what that looks like. Nettie heard it first. Brought it home like a splinter she couldn't dig out on her own. Hands wringing her apron the whole ride out to the ranch. They're saying things, Mr. Rourke. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Ugly things. About you. About her. Let them, sir. Let them say Nettie. His jaw was tight. Tighter than he meant it to sound. I've buried worse than talk, except he hadn't. Not really. Because talk walked a way of becoming something else entirely once it finds the wrong set of hands to hold it, and the wrong hands were already reaching. Waukek didn't come to the ranch again. Not after the last time. Not after Elias had rolled that chair across the yard like a man twice his size and told him exactly what would happen if he came back with that mouth of his. No, Warwick was smarter than that. He went to town instead. Went to the courthouse in the county seat, 2 days' ride, where a man named Prescott Vane kept an office with his name in gold letters on frosted glass and a reputation for finding legal doors where none existed, because that's what money buys, when a man like Warwick has enough of it. Not justice. Just doors, my cousin, Warwick told him, settling into the leather chair across from the desk, is not well. Define not well, confined to a chair. Hasn't left that ranch in years except to bury his own good sense. And now there's a woman living with him. Some kind of, he waved a hand, searching for a word that would land the way he wanted it to, giantess. From a traveling show. No family, no history anyone in town can verify. Just showed up one evening and never left. Vane steepled his fingers. Said nothing yet. Which was its own kind of invitation, I'm concerned. Warwick went on, voice smooth as poured oil, that my cousin, in his weakened state, both physical and I fear mental, is being taken advantage of. Manipulated. That this woman has designs on the ranch. On everything our family built, and you'd be the nearest kin. Only living relative. Vane's mouth curved. Not quite a smile. Something colder. There are provisions, he said slowly, for declaring a man incompetent to manage his own affairs, if it can be under undue influence. If there's evidence of, say, associates from other family, manipulation by an outside party with financial interest, there would be evidence. Warwick leaned forward, up. I could provide it. I imagine you could. And that was that. A deal struck in an office. 2 days' ride from a ranch where a woman who'd been half-assed for a single dishonest thing in her life was at that very moment mending a fence line with her bare hands, because she believed in the place she was building. She had no idea what was coming, neither did Elias, which was exactly how Warwick wanted it. The papers arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a rider from the Countess who wouldn't meet Elias's eyes when Stace's coffee, just handed over the folded documents and turned his kick up around, fast enough to kick up dust in his own wake. Elias sat with them a long moment before he opened them. Sat on the porch, same chair, same board that groaned. Except now there was smoke curling from the chimney behind him. Now there was a woman's alarm's laughter, somewhere in the yard, easy and unguarded, drifting over, from where she breaking a new horse she'd bought cheaply because nobody else could handle it. He didn't want to open the papers because some part of him already knew. He opened them anyway. Petition for guardianship and determination of incapacity. The words swam. He read them twice. 3 times. Each time the meaning didn't change, no matter how hard he willed it to. His cousin was petitioning the court to declare him mentally unfit, to seize control of the ranch, of the accounts, of everything. And the reason, laid out in Vane's careful legal language, was simple: undue influence exerted by one Odessa Kane. A woman of no known family, no verifiable history, residing with the petitioner under circumstances the court might find, upon proper investigation, deeply concerning. Elias's hands were shaking by the time he finished. Not from fear, from something closer to fury. A fury he hadn't felt in 5 years, because for 5 years he hadn't had anything left worth being furious about losing. Now he did, and somebody was trying to take it from him with nothing but ink and lies whilst he didn't tell her that night. Couldn't. Not yet. Because the words wouldn't come, and every time he tried to shape them, some old fear reared up and swallowed them whole. What if she left? What if the accusation alone was enough to make her think she was a burden? What if she decided the whole town's ugly whisper was easier to escape than to fight, so he said nothing? Which was, he'd realize later, its own kind of mistake. The first domino in a line that would nearly topple everything. He watched her across the supper table instead. Watched the lamplight catch the side of her face. Watched her laugh at something Jedediah said about the new horse head tipping back, and thought, with a kind of quiet devastation, that he would burn the whole county down before he let anyone take this away from her. From them, except he wasn't sure yet there was a them. Wasn't sure he'd earned the right to think that word. The second blow came 4 days later, and it came wearing a familiar coat. Ilias heard the wagon first, heard it stop at the gate, heard voices, a man's voice, oily and performative, the kind of voice that had learned to sell things nobody wanted by making them sound like miracles. He wheeled himself to the window and saw a man he'd never met before in his life step down from the wagon like he owned the ground he was standing on. Barnaby Slate. He knew the name before anyone said it. Knew it from Jedediah's telling, months back, by the corral. Knew it the way you know the name of a disease when someone's described the symptoms to you in enough detail. Odessa was in the yard, hanging wash. When she saw him, Elias watched her go still, watched the color drain clean out of her face, watched 10 years of survival instincts snap into place in the space of a single breath. Shoulders squaring, chin lifting, the same posture she'd worn at his gate that first evening, except now there was fear underneath it. Real fear. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that just sits behind the eyes, waiting. Odessa. Slate's voice carried across the yard, warm as poison honey. My, look at you. Living the fine life out here. Get off this land, Barnaby. Now that's no way to greet an old friend. You were never my friend. Her voice didn't shake. He'd give her that. It didn't shake even a little. You were my jailer with a nicer coat. Slate's smile thinned, flickered, just for a second, into something uglier underneath, before smoothing back into that same practiced warmth. Jailer, he clicked his tongue. Such an ugly word for a business arrangement. You signed a contract, my dear. 10 years obligation. You walked out with 2 left on the note. There was no contract that could hold a person like property. There absolutely was. Slate reached into his coat, produced a folded paper, yellowed at the edges, and held it up like a trophy. Signed. Witnessed it. Perfectly legal. And I'll have you know, I've come a very long way to collect what's owed me. Ilias was moving before he'd decided to move. Wheels crunching gravel, faster than dignity allowed, faster than his arms wanted to go, because something primal had taken hold of him, and it did not care about dignity. This is my land, he said, arriving between Slate and Odessa like a wall thrown up in the last second before a flood. And you're trespassing on it. Slate looked him over. Chair. Still hands. And Elias watched the calculation happen behind them, and the man's eyes, watched him decide to wheelchair holds up a real full threat. He was wrong about that. But it would take a moment longer for him to learn it, and you'd be the famous Mr. Rourke. Slate's smile widened. The whole county's talking about you, sir. The invalid rancher and his giant house guest. Quite the pair you make. State your business and leave. My business, Slate said, voice hardening now, all pretense of charm falling away like a mask dropped, is that this woman owes me 2 years of contracted service, and I intend to collect. Either she comes back with me peaceably, or I'll be forced to involve the law. Breach of contract is a serious matter, Mr. Rourke. Even for a giant, she's not your property. She signed a paper that says otherwise. Papers can be wrong, not this one. Slate's eyes glittered, cold now, all the warmth gone. Not when a judge in the county seat already knows my name, knows my business, and happens to owe me a favor or two. Something cold moved through Elias's chest, because that sentence landed different than the rest. That sentence had a shape to it, a shape that matched, too closely, too neatly, the shape of the papers sitting folded in the drawer of his own desk. A judge who owed favors, a county seat 2 days' ride away. The same county seat where his cousin had, apparently, found himself a very expensive lawyer. He didn't say any of that yet. Just filed it away, cold and sharp. In the back of his mind, you'll leave, Elias said stead. Now, and if you come back onto this land, I'll have my men escort you off it at the point of a rifle. Odessa doesn't owe you anything. Not her labor, not her freedom, not 1 single hour of the rest of her life. Slate studied him a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes. You're fond of her, he said slowly, almost curious, aren't you? Elias didn't answer, which was itself an answer. Slate's smile came back, slower this time, meaner. Well, he folded the paper back into his coat. This isn't finished, Mr. Rourke. Not by a mile. I've got a signed contract and a friendly judge, and you've got a chair you can't stand up from. We'll see whose word carries further when this goes in front of a bench." He climbed back onto his wagon. The horses, and as he pulled away, he called back over his shoulder, light as a man remarking on the weather, "Give my regards to your cousin, Rourke. Tell him Barnaby says hello." The wagon rolled off down the road, and Elias sat there, frozen, feeling the ground shift under a chair that could no longer take him anywhere fast enough to escape what he'd just heard. Your cousin, Barnaby says hello. They knew each other, which meant this wasn't two separate storms. It was one storm, wearing two faces. Odessa hadn't moved. Still stood by the washing line, one hand gripping the rope so hard her knuckles had gone white. Odessa. She didn't answer right away. When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were wet, though she blinked hard, fast, like she could hold the tears back before they fell. 10 years, she said, voice low. 10 years I thought I'd finally outrun that man, and here he is, on your land. Like he owns the ground under my feet no matter where I go. He doesn't own anything. Not you. Not 1 inch of you. He's got a piece of paper that says different. Paper can lie. People believe paper, Elias. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on his name, first time she'd used it instead of Rourke. That's the thing about paper. Folks don't ask if it's true. They just ask if it's signed. He didn't have an answer for that. Not one that would fix anything. So he did the only thing he could do. He reached out, took her hand, held it, rough and scraped and strong, in both of his. I believe you, he said. That's not nothing. She looked down at their hands. Something in her face cracked open, just a little, just enough to let some soft through the armor she'd been wearing since the day she was old enough to know the world would stare. No, she said quietly. It's not nothing. That night, Elias didn't sleep, because his mind kept circling back to one word. Cousin. Give my regards to your cousin, because that word didn't fit anywhere it was supposed to fit. Unless it fit exactly where he was afraid it fit. He waited until the house was dark, until he could hear Jedediah's snoring through the thin wall, and Odessa's door shut quiet down the hall, and he wheeled himself into the small room he used as an office. Lit a lamp, pulled open the bottom drawer of the desk where he'd shoved the guardianship papers 4 days before, unable to look at them since. He read them again. Slower this time, looking for something he'd missed. And there, on the 3rd page, in a list of supporting affidavits Vane's office had attached, he found it a name: Barnaby Slate. Proprietor, Slate's Menagerie of Wonders, willing to testify to the subject's history of manipulating vulnerable persons for financial gain. His stomach dropped, because there it was, in black ink, signed. Dated a full week before Slate had ever shown up at the ranch gate, demanding Odessa's return. Which meant Slate hadn't come here on his own, hadn't tracked her down out of some old grudge or genuine contractual claim. He'd been sent. By Warwick. Elias sat there a long moment, lamp flickering, the whole ugly shape of it assembling itself in his mind, like a building going up plank by plank. Warwick needed a reason to call Odessa dangerous, manipulative, a threat to Elias's sanity and safety, and Slate conveniently showed up on cue with exactly that story, wrapped in a contract that may or may not have ever meant what he claimed it meant, timed perfectly to give the guardianship petition teeth. 2 men, 1 plan, were both circling the same prize: his land, his herd, his name, and Odessa, caught in the middle of it, painted as the villain in a story she had never even been told she was part of. He sat with the papers in his lap a long time, because knowing didn't fix anything. Not yet. Knowing was just the first cold step toward a fight he wasn't sure. Sitting in that chair in the dark, he had any legs left to win. He almost laughed at his own joke. Almost. It came out instead as something closer to a broken breath. He told her the next morning. Had to. Couldn't carry it alone another day without it eating something vital out of him. She sat very still while he explained it. The guardianship petition, the affidavit, the dates that lined up too neatly to be anything but planned. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long moment. So it was never about the contract, she said finally, voice flat. It was never even about me. It was always about the ranch. I was just the excuse. You were the easiest excuse to reach for. He hated saying it, hated the truth of it, because you're different.
Because folks in this county
Already look for reasons to be afraid of what they don't understand. Warwick just handed them one, wrapped up pretty, and let them do the rest of the work themselves. She was quiet again. Then, quietly, almost to herself, I spent 10 years being looked at like a monster for money. Now I'm about to be looked at like a monster for free. You're not a monster. His voice came out harder than he meant, urgent, like he needed her to hear it before the words could slip past unclaimed. Not to me. Not to Jedediah. Not to anyone who's actually bothered to look. Half this town hasn't bothered to look, Elias. And the half that has already made up their minds about what they see, he didn't have an answer for that either, because it was true. And there's no arguing a person out of a truth that's already cost him something. The three-way reckoning came on a gray afternoon 2 weeks later at the gate, with clouds building up dark over the western ridge. Like the sky itself had opinions about what was coming, Warwick arrived first. On horseback, Vane's clerk trailing behind with a leather satchel of papers. Slate arrived not 10 minutes after, wagon creaking up the same road, like the timing had been arranged. Because it had been arranged. Elias was waiting for them, Odessa beside him. Jedediah a step behind, shotgun broken over one arm, not pointed at anyone, just present. A fact, a boundary cousin. Warwick's smile was thinner than usual. Something nervous underneath it, though he was working hard to hide that. I trust you've received the paperwork. I've received it. Then you understand the seriousness of the situation. For your own good, Elias, I'd urge you to cooperate. Save us all a distasteful court proceeding. I understand the seriousness, Elias. I understand it a great deal better than you'd like me to, Warwick. Something flickered across Warwick's face. A crack in the smooth surface. I don't follow. I think you do. Elias's voice was low, steady, devastating in its calm. I've been reading your petition, real close. Interesting thing, affidavits. They come with dates on them. And Mr. Slate here, he nodded toward the wagon, where Slate had gone very still, signed his statement about Odessa's supposed dangers a full week before he ever rode onto this land claiming some old contract. Silence, real silence, the kind that has weight, the kind that presses down on a whole scene until somebody has to break it or be crushed by it. That's quite the accusation, Warwick said finally, but his voice had lost its polish. It's not an accusation. It's arithmetic. Elias's eyes moved from Warwick to Slate and back again. You paid this man to show up. Paid him to threaten her, so the town would already be whispering about a dangerous woman before your lawyer has set foot in a courtroom. You built your case on a lie you manufactured yourself. You've no proof of that. I've got the dates, Warwick. I've got a signed statement that predates his arrival. And I've got a judge somewhere who's going to want to know exactly how convenient that timing is. Once it's put in front of him plain, Slate, to his credit or his cowardice, was already backing toward his wagon. I want no part of this, he said quickly. I was paid for a statement. That's all. Whatever's between you two family members is. Get in your wagon. Barnaby, Odessa said, voice like iron. First time she'd spoken since the men arrived. And don't you dare come near me again, he went. Fast. Without another word, without so much as a backward glance, the wheels of his wagon churning dust as he fled a fight that had never truly been his to begin with, which left Warwick alone, exposed. The nervous crack in his composure widening by the second. This changes nothing, he said, though his voice had lost its certainty. The petition stands regardless of how Slate's statement came about. There are other grounds, isolation, undue and influence. The court, Elias said, will hear that my own cousin manufactured false testimony to steal a ranch from a man he's been circling like a buzzard for 5 years. And they'll hear it from me, from Jedediah, from every hand on this property who's watched you visit twice a season with tobacco and newspapers, sizing up my land like a man measuring a coffin. Warwick's jaw worked. No smooth words left to reach for. You'll regret this, he said finally. Weak, the kind of threat men make when they've already lost and know it. I regret a lot of things, Warwick. Elias's voice didn't rise. didn't need to. Trusting you as far as I did is chief among them. That regret ends today. Warwick turned his horse, rode off out without another word, and this time there was no cloud of dust hanging with menace in the air behind him. Just a man retreating from a fight he'd started and could no longer win outright. But Elias knew, watching him go, that this wasn't over. Men like Warwick didn't simply give up a prize they'd wanted this badly. They regrouped. They found new doors. The petition was still sitting in a courthouse 2 days' ride away, and somewhere in that courthouse a hearing date was already being set. The days after should have felt like victory. They didn't, because word of the confrontations spread through town faster than the truth ever could. And the truth, as it turned out, wasn't nearly as entertaining as the story that had already taken root. Folks didn't care much for arithmetic and affidavit dates. They cared for the shape of a story they already liked telling. The invalid rancher, the giant woman. The scandal of it all. Elias found that out on a night he shouldn't have gone into town at all. He'd needed supplies, simple as that. Nails, rope, a part for the well pump that Jedediah couldn't fix without a trip to the mercantile. He'd told himself it was just an errand. Except the mercantile closed early that evening, and the only place still lit up on the main street was the saloon, and he found himself wrong to supposed open doors at the exact wrong moment. Close enough to hear voices that hadn't noticed him yet in the dark outside. Heard the giants got him wrapped clean around her finger. Can you blame the poor fool? Man's had nothing since his wife left. First warm body that walks up his road, of course he loses his head over her. Shame of it is she'll be gone the second some. Able-bodied man looks her way twice. Woman like that isn't going to spend her best years pushing a cripple's chair around a ranch. Mark my words. Wouldn't blame her either. What's he got to offer, really? Can't even stand at his own supper table laughter. Careless, thoughtless laughter. The kind that costs the people making it nothing at all, and costs the person overhearing it everything. Elias sat frozen in the dark outside that saloon for a long moment, because those words did something no lawsuit, no cousin, no circus owner had managed to do. They found the oldest wound, the one underneath all the others. The one that had been bleeding quiet since Adelaide, while the Adelaide had sit on the kitchen table and right off toward a life where he had no place in it. Not good enough, not whole enough. Not man enough to keep a woman who deserved better than half of one. He turned the chair around, rolled home in the dark without part, without the nails, without anything but a hollow, familiar ache reopened wide in his chest, and a fear that had been sleeping 5 years finally waking up hungry. He didn't sleep that night either, lay awake in the dark, and his mind wouldn't stop circling, wouldn't stop turning that saloon conversation over and over like a stone worn smooth from handlings. Because what if they're right? Because Odessa deserves a man who can stand beside her, a man who can ride, who can work a fetal shoulder to shoulder with her instead of watching from a chair. A man whole in every sense the word demands, until he pictured her 10 years from now. Still young, still strong, still capable of so much more than a life spent easing a wheelchair over uneven ground that loved her enough to imagine a future she deserved instead of the one he could give her, began to believe the ugly thing the saloon voices had said, except he loved her, which made the whole thing worse, not better. Because loving someone and being good for them, he was starting to fear in the dark, weren't always the same coin. So by morning, exhausted, hollowed out, he had convinced himself of something that felt, in the gray light before dawn, like the noblest decision of his entire life. He was wrong. He didn't know that yet. He only knew he couldn't sit across from her one more morning and let her keep giving her best years to a man the whole county had already decided was less than whole. He called her into the front room after breakfast. Papers already laid out on the desk. A deed, an account book. Things he'd spent half the night preparing by lamplight, hands shaking the entire time. She came in wiping a flour from her hands, smiling at first, that easy morning smile she'd started wearing more often these last weeks. The one that had slowly, quietly, become the thing he looked forward to most about waking up. The smile faded when she saw his face. "Elias, sit down, Odessa. You're scaring me." "Sit," she sat, slow, watching him with eyes that had already, somehow, guessed at something terrible before he'd said a single word. "I've made a decision," he said, voice carefully flat, rehearsed. "You and I both know this county isn't going to stop talking, isn't going to stop looking for reasons to tear down what we've built here. And I won't have you spending your best years fighting a war that was never yours to fight." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you should go." The words came out steadier than he felt saying them. "I've deeded you the old Miller place at the edge of my land. 200 acres, good water, a house that just needs some fixing. There's an account set up in your name at the bank in town. Enough that you'll never want for anything again. You're free, Odessa. Free of Slate. Free of every ugly word this town has ever thrown at you. You deserve a life that isn't tangled up in a man who can't even. Don't." Her voice cracked across the room like a whip. "Don't you dare finish that sentence. You deserve a whole man," he said it anyway. Had to. Had come this far and couldn't stop now without the whole fragile resolve collapsing. One who can stand beside you, walk beside you. Not one who watches from a chair while you carry every hard thing alone. Silence. Terrible silence. "In all this time," she said, "not one single day, have I ever looked at you and seen half a man in that chair. Not once. The only person who's ever looked at me and seen a monster." Her voice shook now. Finally, the armor cracking wide open was every single stranger who ever paid a nickel to gawk at me behind a rope. And the only person who's ever looked at you and decided you're only half of something. Her eyes were wet, furious, grieving already before she'd even left the room.
"Is you, right now, in this chair?"
"Doing it to yourself." She turned, walked to the door, stopped there. "Didn't look back, I'll pack my things," she said. "Since you've already decided this for both of us." She was gone down the hall, footsteps heavy and final, and Elias sat alone in that front room with a deed and an account book and the terrible, dawning understanding that he had just made, in the name of love, the single greatest mistake of his entire life. The storm outside was gathering again. Dark clouds building over the western ridge, same as the day the flood had nearly taken his herd, same as the day everything had first started to change. Except this time, the flood he'd have to survive was one he'd built entirely with his own two hands. And he had no idea yet whether there'd be anything left to Sex Landing on the other side of it. The wagon was already loaded by noon. Not much to load. Odessa Kane had come into this house with a single bundle of belongings, and she was leaving it the same way, except now there was a small trunk too. One Jedediah had built her without being asked. Quiet in the way loyal men are quiet when they can't say what they mean out loud. She stood in the yard, waited for nothing. Because there was nothing left to wait, for Elias watched from the window. Didn't go out. Couldn't. Some part of him kept thinking she'd turn around. Kept thinking she'd storm back up those porch steps and tell him he was a fool, and he'd agree. And this would all just be a bad dream he'd wake from, with her still in the kitchen, making coffee that smelled like a life he actually wanted. She didn't turn around. She climbed up onto the wagon seat, took the reins in both hands, and Jedediah, standing by the gate with his hat in his hands instead of on his head, looked like a man attending a funeral he hadn't agreed to. "Ma'am," his voice cracked on it. "You don't have to. He's already decided, Jedediah." She didn't look at the house. Couldn't, maybe. Not much left to argue about when a man's made up his mind to save you from himself. She snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward a watt, and Elias Rook sat in his chair by the window of a house that had, for a handful of months, finally felt like something other than a grave, and watched the only good thing that had walked through his gate in 5 years roll away down the same dusty road she'd arrived on. He told himself this was noble. He told himself this was love. He told himself a lot of things in that first hour, sitting frozen at that window, and every single one of them was a lie he'd built to keep from admitting the truth. Which was this: he was a coward, not because he couldn't stand, because he'd let a saloon full of strangers and his own oldest wound decide, for both of them, what love was and wasn't allowed to look like. Jedediah found him there an hour later, still at the window. "Still frozen, you gonna sit there," the old man said. "Or you gonna do something about it?" "There's nothing to do, Jedediah. You already made the biggest damn mistake of your life." "Is what you already did." Jedediah's voice, usually so mild, so careful, cracked like a whip across the quiet room. 50 years I worked this land. Watched your daddy build it. Watched you nearly kill yourself, getting thrown off horses, trying to prove something to nobody. And in all that time, I never once saw a woman look at you the way that one looked at you this morning before you broke her heart clean in half. I did it for her. You did it for you. Jedediah didn't back down. You did it because some fool in a saloon said something ugly, and instead of standing up and calling it the lie it was, you decided to believe it faster than anybody. Sound familiar? That's exactly what your cousin's been counting on since the day he rode up that road. Somebody in this family finally believing the worst about themselves before anybody else has to convince them of it. Elias sat very still, because that landed. Landed hard, harder than anything Warwick or Slate or the whole Gossip County had managed to land in weeks. "She's already gone," he said, voice hollow, wagons slow, and the Miller Road's got a washout, 2 miles past the fork that'll cost her the better part of an hour going around. Jedediah settled his hat back on his head, finally, like a man who'd said his piece and meant every word. "Question is whether you're going to spend that hour sitting at this window, feeling sorry for yourself, or whether you're going to do something a man with no legs and every ounce of sense he was born with ought to do. Which is what? Go after her, son." Jedediah's voice gentled, just slightly. "Don't matter that you can't run. Matter is whether you're willing to chase." The office, that was the thing Jedediah didn't know yet. The thing that would change everything, if Elias could just get to it in time. He wheeled himself down the hall fast, faster than his arms wanted to go, burning already, and threw open the door to the small room where he kept the ranch's accounts, and found Warwick standing there, bent over the open desk drawer, the very drawer where the guardianship papers had sat for weeks. A stack of documents in his hands, one of them Elias's eyes caught, instantly bearing a signature at the bottom that looked exactly like his own, except he had never signed it. Never signed anything. Warwick. His cousin froze, papers still in hand, guilt written plain across a face that had spent a lifetime learning to hide it, and in this one ungood moment, forgot how. Elias. This isn't. What is that? Silence. Warwick's mouth, opened, closed, opened again, searching for a lie, fast enough to outrun the truth already sitting in his hands. "Give it to me, Elias. Listen, give me the paper, Warwick." He handed it over, slow, hand shaking, and Elias looked down at a deed transfer. His name forged at the bottom in a hand that was close enough to fool a careless eye, but not close enough to fool the man whose actual signature it was to be. A deed transferring the ranch's water rights, and with them everything downstream into Warwick's name, dated 3 weeks ago. Which meant Warwick hadn't just been circling this land with a lawsuit. He'd already been planning to steal it outright the moment the guardianship went through, or maybe even before, banking on the chaos of a courtroom fight to cover the theft entirely. "You forged my signature. I was going to explain everything. Once the court, you were going to steal my water rights and let a judge 2 days away decide whether I was too broken in the head to notice." Elias's voice was very quiet now, quieter than Warwick had ever heard it, and somehow more frightening than any shout could have been. "How long, Warwick? How long have you been planning this?" Warwick said nothing, which was answer enough. "Get out." Elias's hands were steady on the wheels of his chair now, steady in a way they hadn't been in weeks. "Get off my land, and pray, cousin, truly pray, that I don't ride into that courthouse with this paper in my hand and let the whole county see exactly what kind of man you really are." Warwick left. Fast. Papers in Elias's lap now, the forged deed a live coal he could finally use. But that fire would have to wait, because there was a wagon on the Miller Road, slow on account of a washout 2 miles past the fork, and a woman on it who thought she'd just been thrown away by the one person who was supposed to better. He had maybe 40 minutes. He wasn't going to waste one of them. Getting the modified cart, hitched alone, should have taken 20 minutes. Elias did it in 8, hands raw, shoulders screaming, because some things a desperate man simply finds a way to do faster than should be possible. He drove that cart out onto the road like a man who'd forgotten entirely that his legs didn't work, because in that moment, chasing down the only thing that mattered, they didn't need to. The road unspooled ahead of him, dust, ruts, and late afternoon light, slanting gold, through the cottonwoods, and he pushed the horse harder than he should have, harder than was safe for a man who couldn't easily catch himself if the cart pitched. He didn't care, because somewhere ahead of him was a woman who had held a floodgate hatch with her bare hands and never once asked anybody to be grateful for it. A woman who had looked at a cripple in a chair and seen, from the very first evening, a whole man instead of half of one. A woman he had just spent one entire terrible morning telling in so many careful, noble words that she deserved better than him. He'd been wrong. He needed to say so before the road ran out. He caught up to her at the washout, exactly where Jedediah said he would. Wagon stopped at the edge of a gully cut deep by the recent storm. Odessa standing beside it, studying the drop with the same flat, exhausted expression of a woman who has run out of patience for one more obstacle in a day already full of them. She heard the cart before she turned, and when she did turn, when she saw him there, dust-covered, breathing hard, reins still clutched in white-knuckled hands, something in her face did a complicated, painful thing. Hope and anger arriving at exactly the same moment, neither one willing to yield the floor to the other. "What are you doing here?" Being an idiot slower than usual. He pulled the cart up short. "Odessa, don't!" Her voice was tight. "Don't you dare come out here and tell me you've changed your mind because you feel guilty." "I don't want guilt, Elias. I've had enough people feel sorry for me to last 2 lifetimes. It's not guilt. Then what is it?" "It's the truth," he said it plain. "No dressing it up this time. No noble speeches. I was wrong this morning. I let a saloon full of drunk fools decide what I deserved before I ever let myself decide it. I told you to go because I was scared, Odessa. Scared that loving you meant asking you to spend your whole life easing a chair over rough ground while you deserved a man who could stand beside you. And I told myself that was noble. It wasn't noble. It was the same kind of coward thing your own kin did to you the day they sold you except dressed up prettier. That's not fair, no. It's not." He didn't look away from her. "But it's true, and I'd rather you be angry at a true thing than grateful for a lie. I don't need my legs to walk beside you, Odessa. I never did. I just need the sense God gave me to stop being afraid of something good." Silence. The gully below them cut raw and red by the storm. The horse shifting, impatient in its traces. "You deeded me 200 acres this morning," she said finally, voice unsteady. "Told me I was free. I was wrong about that too." Or he caught himself corrected. "Urgent now. Not wrong that you're free. You've always been free, Odessa. Free before you ever met me and free no matter what I do next. But I was wrong thinking freedom meant being free of me. I don't want you free of me. I want," he stopped. Throat tight. "I want you to choose me," he said finally. "Not out of a trade. Not out of gratitude. Not because you've got nowhere else to go. I want you to choose me because for one single day, one single hour, you thought I might actually be worth choosing." Her eyes were wet now, furious and grieving, and something else too, something that looked almost terribly like hope trying to survive one more disappointment. "You threw me away this morning, I know. You didn't even ask what I wanted, you just decided. For both of us, I know that too," his voice cracked. "And I've got no excuse good enough to fix it. Only the truth, which is that I've been afraid every single day, and Adeline left that anything good in my life is just waiting for the moment to be taken away again. So this morning, when I thought that's what was coming for us, I decided to be the one who did the taking instead. Better me than fate, I told myself. Except that's the same cowardice as running Odessa, just wearing a nicer coat." She was quiet a long moment, the gully wind picking up. cool with the promise of another evening, storm, some building somewhere behind the ridge. Warwick forged my signature, Elias said, when the silence had stretched long enough that he feared it might swallow everything. Was trying to steal the water rights outright. I caught him not 20 minutes after you left, which means this isn't over. The petition's still sitting in that courthouse, and there's still a hearing coming, and I'm going to need every ounce of help I can get to fight it properly. So that's why you came. No, he said it fast, firm. I came because I love you. The lawsuit's a separate fight, and I'll fight it, whether you're standing beside me or 200 acres away, at the Miller place, hating my name. But I'd rather fight it with you beside me, Odessa. Not because I need someone to hold a gate shut in a flood, because I need someone who makes a house feel like something worth the defending in the first place. She looked at him a long, long moment. The wind moved through her hair. Loose now, come undone somewhere on the rough ride out. You hurt me this morning, she said quietly. I know. I don't forgive easy. Never have. 10 years of being looked at like a curiosity teaches a person to keep their guard up. I know that too. But, and here her voice broke. Just slightly, just enough. I spent that whole ride telling myself I was fine. Telling myself I've survived worse. And every mile I told myself that. Some part of me was hoping you'd come find me before I believed it. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. I'm here, he said. Found you before the mile ran out. Barely, but I'm here. Barely counts. Barely's all I've got most days. Figured you'd learn to work with what's in front of you. And there it was. Something breaking loose in her face, finally. The first real hint of a smile, since the wagon had rolled out of the yard that morning. Small and reluctant and entirely real. Get down off that cart, she said. If you're going to apologize properly, you're going to do it without a whole conveyance between us. He didn't need telling twice. They didn't go back to the ranch that evening. Not yet. They sat together at the edge of that gully instead, the horse cropping grass nearby, the sun beginning its long, slow fall toward the ridge, and they talked. Really talked in a way they hadn't quite managed before, both of them, laying down pieces of themselves they'd kept guarded even through months of living under the same roof. He told her about that word, never, about the doctor, cold voice and colder hands, about the years of watching Adeline cry by the window, and never once finding the courage to tell her it wasn't her, regardless. Yes. That some part of him had already known, long before she left, that the marriage was drowning, and he'd been too proud to swim toward her. She told him about the first town that had ever paid to look at her, about being 12 years old, already taller than her own father, and being sold, that was the word for it. Sold, no matter how gently her family had tried to dress it to a man with a painted wagon and a silver tongue. About 10 years standing on a platform while strangers pointed and laughed, and sometimes, worse than laughing, went quiet with a kind of horrified fascination that felt like being erased it and stared at all at once. You know what the worst part was, she said, staring out over the gully, voice far away. It wasn't the strangers. Strangers I could hate clean and simple. It was the moments somebody looked kind, looked like they might actually see a person instead of an exhibit.
Because those moments gave you hope. And hope is the most expensive thing a person in a cage can afford to carry. And now?
She looked at him. Really looked the way she had that very first evening at his gay gate. Now I'm finding out hope isn't as expensive as I thought, she said. Provided the man carrying it with you doesn't panic and throw it away the first time somebody in a saloon says something ugly. Fair, very fair, he almost laughed. Almost. And this time, when it came easier than it had in years. The hearing was set for the second week of October, in the same courthouse 2 days' rum's ride from Sable Creek, where Warwick had first purchased himself a lawyer and a plan. Elias spent those 2 weeks preparing like a man readying for war, which, in every way that mattered, he was. He gathered every hand who'd worked the ranch since Odessa's arrival, every one of them willing to testify to her character, her labor, the plain fact that the man they worked for had never once in all those months, shown a single sign of the confused, Manipulated fool Warwick's petition claimed him to be. He gathered the forged deed, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, along with a letter from a clerk at the county seat, paid handsomely for his honesty, a rare and valuable commodity, confirming that Warwick had indeed visited Prescott Vane's office full week before Barnaby Slate ever set foot on Rourke land. Jedediah rode the 2 days to the county seat with him, refusing flatly to let Elias make the trip alone, and Odessa rode beside them both, chin high, daring the whole territory to say one word about it. They arrived at the courthouse on a cold gray morning with frost still silvering the grass, and the Biltitums both, squat and gray-stoned, sat waiting like something that had already decided how this would end. Elias didn't let that stop him. He'd come too far to let a building's mood decide anything. The courtroom filled fast. Word had traveled, the way word always travels, and half the county seemed to have found some excuse to be present, packed onto hard wooden benches, murmuring behind gloved hands. Warwick sat at the front with Vane beside him, both men in fine coats, both wearing expressions of practiced, injured concern like men doing a difficult but necessary duty for the good of a beloved but troubled relative. Judge Ambrose Thorne presided. A heavy-set man with a face like carved granite, known Elias, had learned in the 2 weeks of frantic preparation for being no particular friend to either side of any case, which was, in its own cold way, the best a man in Elias's position could hope for. This court is convened, Thorne intoned, to determine the mental competency of one Elias Rourke, and the appropriateness of a guardianship petitioned by Warwick Rourke on his behalf. Vane rose first, laid out the petition with practiced, oily precision. The isolation. The unexplained arrival of an unfamiliar woman of, as he put it with careful distaste, considerable and unusual physical stature. The rumors circulating through the county regarding manipulation, undue influence, a man weakened by injury and grief made vulnerable to exploitation. He called Warwick to testify first. Watched him perform grief and concern with the polish of a man who'd rehearsed every line. Elias's turn came. He answered every question steady, unshaken, laid out the timeline of the forged deed plain and clear for the judge to see. Watched Vane's confidence waver. As the paper itself was entered into evidence, the signature comparison stark and damning under the courtroom's gray light. But Vane wasn't finished. Not yet, Your Honor, he said, recovering, regardless of any dispute regarding a separate property matter. The core question remains whether Mr. Rourke's judgment has been compromised by his association with Miss Kane. I would like to call a witness who can speak to her character. Mr. Barnaby Slate. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Elias's dropped thought. He hadn't expected Slate to actually show, not after the man had fled the ranch gate weeks earlier without so much as a backward glance. But there he was, rising from a bench near the back, smoothing his coat, stepping forward with the same oily confidence he'd worn. The day he'd tried to claim Odessa as unpaid property, he took the stand, was sworn in. Mr. Slate. Vane began. You've had a prior business dealings with Miss Kane. I have. Ran a traveling exhibition for many years. Miss Kane was, for a decade, one of its featured performers, and in your professional experience, would you characterize her as someone capable of manipulating a vulnerable man for financial gain? Slate's eyes flicked once, briefly, toward Odessa, sitting rigid beside Elias, chin high, refusing to give him the satisfaction of flinching. I would, Slate said. In my experience, Miss Kane is. That's a lie. The voice came from the back of the courtroom, old, rough, carrying the particular authority of a man who has earned the right to interrupt a proceeding and knows it. Every head, turned an old man, was rising from the last bench. Weathered, gray-bearded, wearing a coat with a faded blue trim that Elias recognized, with a small jolt, as the uniform of a Union cavalry veteran. The kind of coat men still wore with pride 2 decades after the war that had shaped so much of the country's grief. Order, Thorne said, though without much force, evidently curious himself. State your name and your business here, sir. Name's Corwin Ashby. Served for 4 years cavalry during the war before I came west and spent the better part of a decade working odd jobs. including 3 winters as a hand for Mr. Slate's traveling show. He fixed Slate with a look that could have curdled milk. I know exactly what kind of operation that man ran. And I've got things to say about it. If the court'll permit. Thorne studied him a long moment, then looked at Vane, at Slate, whose face had gone the color of old paper. The court will hear it, Thorne said. Approach. Ashby made his way to the stand, was sworn in, sat with the straight-back discomfort of a man unused to being listened to and determined to make the most of it now that he was. Mr. Ashby, Thorne said, you were employed by Mr. Slate's exhibition. 3 winters. Handled the wagons, mostly. Saw plenty I wish I hadn't, such as a girl no older than 12, brought in by her own kin for money, put on a platform, and made to stand there, while strangers poked at her like she was a prize hog at auction. Such as that same girl, grown into a young woman, working 16 iron-hour days for wages that never once matched what was promised, and threatened with the law any time she so much as spoke of leaving. Ashby's voice was steady, but something old and angry burned underneath it. Such as watching Mr. Slate here draft a contract for that same young woman, knowing full well she couldn't read past a 3rd-grade schooling, knowing full well she'd sign whatever put food on the table that week. Objection, Vane said, rising fast. This is hearsay, Your Honor. Ancient history with no bearing on. It bears directly, Thorne cut in, on the character and credibility of a witness this court is being asked to trust regarding Miss Kane's own character. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Ashby. Ashby continued. Told the court, in plain unhurried language, about the winter Odessa Kane had come down with a fever bad enough to nearly kill her, and Slate had made her perform anyway, propped up on that platform, because a nickel was a nickel, and sympathy didn't pay wages. Told them about the night she finally ran, and how Slate had sworn to every hand in the outfit that he'd see her locked up for the theft of contracted services if she was ever found. Though there had been no theft, nothing stolen but her own body from a man who'd never had any rightful claim to it in the first place. I left that outfit not long after she did, Ashby finished. Couldn't stomach it anymore. Heard, some months back, through folks I still know that circuit, that Slate was asking around after a woman answering her description, offering money for word of where she'd landed. Didn't think much of it till I heard my own name mentioned in connection with a hearing way out here, on account of an old Army friend of mine clerking for the county now, who recalled, "Why'd once that shop on, thought I ought to know what was being said in this room today." He looked finally straight at Slate. Wasn't hard to guess what kind of story you'd be telling. Given what I already know of you, the courtroom had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that follows the sound of something breaking. Thorne studied Slate a long moment. The man had gone pale. Hands gripping the rail of the witness stand like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Mr. Slate," Thorne said, voice like granite, settling into place. "Is there any part of Mr. Ashbomsby's testimony you dispute?" Slate opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, Your Honor. The arrangements with Miss Kane were entirely legal. Whatever this man's personal grievances, that is not what I asked. Silence. "I have nothing further to say," Slate managed finally, and it was, in its own way, the closest thing to a confession the room was ever going to get out of him. Vane tried to salvage what he could, argued that whatever Slate's failings, the core question of Mr. Rourke's competencies remained separate and unresolved, but the room had already turned. Elias could feel it, the way you feel weather changing before the first drop falls. The murmur running through the benches, now sympathetic instead of suspicious. The same folks who'd whispered about a giant and a cripple now looking, for the first time, at a woman who'd survived something most of them couldn't imagine and still found the strength every single day to build instead of break. Thorne called a brief recess. Returned 20 minutes later with a face set in the particular stillness of a man who has already made up his mind and is only observing the formality of announcing it properly. "What? This court finds," he said, "that the petition for guardianship filed by Warwick Rourke was constructed on testimony obtained through paid and predetermined arrangement with a witness whose own character has now been called gravely into question. The court further finds documentary evidence of a forged property transfer, executed by the same petitioner, which this court regards as more than sufficient cause to question the petitioner's own motives and character rather than those of the respondent. He looked directly at Warwick. The petition is dismissed with prejudice, and this court is inclined to refer the matter of the forged deed to the county prosecutor for further action, unless Mr. Elias Rourke wishes to decline pursuing charges. Every eye in the room turned to Elias. He sat with it a long moment, felt Odessa's hand find his under the table, steady, warm, present in a way that made the decision easier than it might have been a year ago, back when he was a man who still measured his worth in old grudges and older wounds. "I don't decline, Your Honor," he said finally. "My cousin tried to steal my land, my water, and very nearly my sanity in the eyes of the law. Worse than that, he paid a man to slander a woman who has done nothing but bring life back to a place that was slowly dying before she arrived. I'd like the light of law to remember that plainly, so the next man who thinks a wheelchair's target thinks twice." Warwick, 3 benches away, had gone the color of ash. Thorne nodded once. Sharp. Final. So ordered. They rode back to Sable Creek, slower than they'd come, no longer racing against a hearing date, no longer racing against anything at all except the ordinary turning of days. Warwick would stand trial in the spring, would eventually sell what little he had left to cover restitution and legal costs, would leave the county entirely, rather than live out his days among people who now knew exactly what kind man he'd shown himself to be. Slate, too, found himself facing older accusations, dredged back up by Ashby's testimony, accusations from other towns, other years, other young people who'd once stood on his platforms and never been asked, not once, whether they wanted to be looked that way. He was arrested before the month was out, charges of coerced labor stacking up faster than his lawyer could manage them. Neither man's downfall brought Odessa any triumphant satisfaction exactly. Just a kind of quiet, exhausted relief. The relief of a door finally truly locking shut behind her. You don't have to look so somber about it. Elias told her one evening, the two of them back on the porch, same chair, same rocking chair Jedediah had built for her without asking, the boards beneath them creaking in a way that had stopped sounding lonely months ago. Man tried to sell you like livestock. Nobody would blame you for a little satisfaction. I know, she rocked slow, watching the sun go down gold over the western ridge. I think I just spent so many years surviving that man. I don't quite know what to do with a version of the world where I don't have to anymore. You'll learn, will I? You learn to hold a floodgate shut with your bare hands. He reached over, found her hand where it rested on the arm of the rocker. Learning to just be happy ought to be easier than that. She laughed. Real laughter. Easy and unguarded. The kind that had become, somewhere in these last strange, hard, wonderful months, the sound he most looked forward to hearing every single day. The wedding came in November, when the cottonwoods along Sable Creek had gone the color of old gold coins, and the first heart's frost had finally silvered Glug's grass for good. It was small. Neither one of them wanted the whole county gawking, though the whole county came anyway, because word travels, and because by then most folks had quietly, sheepishly, revised their opinion of the giant woman who'd saved a flood-drowned brown herd and stood strong through a courtroom fight that had exposed 2 genuinely wicked men for exactly what they were. The little church at the edge of town had never held a ceremony quite like it. Elias in his chair, cleaned and pressed, wheeled up the aisle by Jedediah, who'd bought a new hat for the occasion and hadn't stopped beaming since sunrise. Odessa entering after him, tall enough that she had to duck slightly beneath the doorframe, dressed simple, hair loose the way he loved it best, walking not on any man's arm but beside Nettie, who'd asked to accompany her, because, as Odessa had said plainly the week before, she'd be given away by the women who'd stood by her, not the men who'd once tried to sell her. Reverend Micah Wren. A soft-spoken man with kind eyes, and a voice made for exactly this kind of morning, stood before them both and spoke words that would be repeated around Sable Creek for years after. Marriage, he said, looking out over the packed pews, is not two whole people becoming one. It is two people, each already whole in their own right, choosing today to stand together anyway. I have known few couples who understand that truth as plainly as these two standing before me now. One who could not walk toward love, and did so anyway by every means available to him. One who was told her whole life she was too much of everything to ever be loved rightly, and found at last a man who understood that too much was never the problem at all. He looked at Elias, at Odessa. Do you, Elias Rourke? Take this woman, in strength and in weakness, not as someone to be carried, but as someone to walk beside for the rest of your days? I do. His voice didn't waver. Hadn't wavered on anything that mattered in months. And do you, Odessa Kane? Take this man, not as someone to be pitied, but as someone whose whole heart you have already seen, plain and entire, long before this morning? I do. Her voice, when it came, was steady as bedrock. Have done, for longer than either of us was brave enough to admit. The little church erupted. Not in scandalized whispers this time. In something warmer. Something like Goiche that had been waiting, patient, for exactly this kind of morning, to finally arrive. They didn't stop there, because a house that has learned to open its doors once rarely learns to close them again. The following spring, two brothers showed up at the Rourke gate, thin and hollow-eyed, veterans of a war neither one talked about much. One missing an arm, below the elbow, the other carrying a limp that would never fully heal. They'd heard, traveling through, about a rancher and his wife, who didn't turn away folks the rest of the world had already decided weren't worth much. Ilias didn't hesitate. Didn't need to consult anybody, least of all himself. There's a bunkhouse needs mending, he told them, and hands enough to do the mending provided you're willing to learn a rancher's work. Alongside a rancher's welcome, they stayed, worked hard. Found in time. This is the same thing Odessa had found that first stormy evening built by people who once been looked at. Brenda had a particular knack for teaching a person how whole they'd actually been all along. By the time the second frost of that year silvered the grass again, the Rourke Ranch had grown into something neither Elias nor Odessa could have imagined during those long, lonely years before the other arrived. A place that didn't measure a person's worth by what the world had already decided they lacked. Some evening, Elias would sit on that same porch, in that same chair, and watch the sun go down gold over the western ridge, same as it had 1,000 times during those 5 hollow years. Except now Odessa sat beside him, her hand in his, the sound of hands and hammers and easy laughter drifting up from a bunkhouse full of people the world had once written off entirely. You ever think about it, she asked him once, quiet, the two of them alone in the particular piece of a day well spent, how close we both came to never opening that gate at all. Every day. And he looked at her. At the woman who'd walked into his life carrying nothing but a bundle of belongings and a decade of scars, and had somehow, against every likelihood the world had stacked against them both, built something neither of them had believed themselves worthy of building. And I think he said slowly that the whole world spends a great deal of time deciding who's whole and who isn't based on things that don't actually measure a person at all. Legs, height. What a body can or can't do. He squeezed her hand. Took losing mine and you losing the right to be looked at plain for both of us to finally learn what actually makes a person whole. We're choosing to open the gate, he said, even when the world outside it doesn't look the way you expected. And choosing, every single morning after, to keep it open. She smiled at that, leaned her head carefully against his shoulder. The two of them fit together in a way that had nothing to do with or matching strength and everything to do with a match far rarer and far more durable than either. The sun finished its fall behind the ridge and, for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither one watched it go down with any grief at all, only gratitude for a road that had once seemed to lead nowhere but loneliness and had led instead exactly where it was always meant to.